Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that's being organized by the Institute for Knowledge and Innovation, Southeast Asia, Bangkok University, and World Bank Organizational Knowledge Sharing Program. This is the first in a series of a new webinar initiative aimed at sharing experiences among knowledge management professionals on how organizational knowledge sharing and knowledge management tools and approaches are being utilized to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic. And each session will highlight one or more organizations or sectors that are utilizing knowledge management as a way of addressing various challenges during this pandemic. And we're very pleased for this inaugural session to be focusing on the topic of how cities, and particularly cities that are part of the Global Resilient Cities Network, are involved in knowledge sharing. My name is Phil Karp. I'm an independent knowledge management specialist, formerly with the World Bank. I'd like to say a little bit about sort of the ground rules for this session before we begin. I encourage you to utilize the chat window to introduce yourselves. Please remember to select all participants when you send a message so that it goes to everyone. Feel free to introduce yourself and your organization. Before we begin and before we turn to our speakers, we'd like to run a couple of polls to get a sense of who is joining us today. You'll find in your chat window a link to Poll Everywhere, where I encourage you to go there, and we'll launch or run the first poll. So you'll see a link to Poll Everywhere. Please click on that link and it will take you to the first poll. Is the poll activated, Vincent?
Yes, it is. It's running. So you want me to share my screen?
Yes, let's share the screen and see the results.
Here we are.
So it looks like the majority are from East Asia, although we have quite a number from Europe. So those of you in Europe, welcome. South Asia, we even have a few from North America who are up at very early in the morning North America time. That's great. Let's move to the second poll so we get a sense of the types of organizations represented.
Okay, it's activated. Yeah.
Let's share the results.
Okay, just 1 second. My window is frozen. Okay. Share screen. Just how come it doesn't appear in my optional windows? here we go. Sorry. Can you see my screen?
Yes, so we have, looks like we have a few people from government organizations, private sector, quite a few others. When we move on later to consultations, it'll be interesting to hear the other types of organizations represented. So thank you for that, Vincent. We're now going to invite Bruno Laporte, who is one of the co-founders of the organizational knowledge sharing and capacity building program, to give a quick overview of the program for those who may not be familiar before we invite our three panelists. So Bruno, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background so that you understand what the organizational knowledge sharing program is. Over the last 10 years, colleagues at the World Bank have been helping several organizations, usually government organizations, but not only, strengthen their capacity in knowledge sharing. And that has been done in many parts of the world, many of the continents that are represented today. And it has been done also for several sectors in those countries. And also at different levels, at the national level, at the regional level, and even at the local level. Out of this practice, a few years ago, we put together the World Bank entered into a partnership with Bangkok University and the institute that Vincent Ribier manages at Bangkok University. We put together a series of knowledge sharing certificates that allow people to come and in Bangkok and learn the range of approaches and tools that we have been using as we were assisting clients all over the world. And this is the what we call the OKS framework. Just to give you a sense, this OKS program, the Organizational Knowledge Sharing Program, is based on a framework, and I will very quickly, this is a very short introduction, almost a teaser to the program, but I just want to give you the elements that when you think about the capacity of organization to become fully enabled in terms of knowledge and learning, what are we looking at? Well, we are looking at the enabling environment, namely whether organizations have got a leadership and culture that really support knowledge sharing across the organization. We are also looking at what are the governance, the organizational aspects and the skills and the system that are need to be in place in order, again, to facilitate the sharing of knowledge. Of course, there are aspects of financing, and very importantly, knowledge is not the only the purview of one organization. Usually organizations draw on a very large network of organization of partners in order to share knowledge. So in that first left-hand side of this framework, you can see a number of enabling conditions that make it possible for organization to be performing in terms of knowledge and learning. On the right-hand side, in the certificate program, we get into actual skills that are necessary for people that are in the business of knowledge and learning, but not only those that are in the business of knowledge and learning, because we feel that it is really the role of everybody in an organization to be vectors of sharing knowledge. So those specific skills are things like, how do you identify what are your knowledge assets in an organization? How, what are the techniques in order to capture them? How you go from capturing that knowledge and turn what you have captured into actual knowledge and learning products. What are the options, the tools, the instruments to share knowledge? That's another piece of the program, all the way down to what are the techniques to monitor, evaluate the impact of your initiatives. So we have been, over the last several years, we have been delivering those knowledge sharing certificates in Bangkok. And there are 3 certificates that we plan on delivering in 2021. We had to put on hold, of course, the last one that was to take place in June. So the first one is the knowledge strategy certificate, and basically how does an organization develop a strategy for sharing knowledge, and what are the building pieces as I just discussed. The second certificate is about how do you capture knowledge, the skills and techniques to do that. And the third one has to do with dissemination of knowledge in organization. As you can see, we have dates at the beginning of June to mid-June for those 3 certificates, and hopefully we'll be in a position to deliver those certificates in Bangkok. We draw on a range of resources. There are books that have been published on these various techniques and approaches, or whether they are about the strategy or the capturing of solution or the art of knowledge exchange of sharing. I just want also to say that these are very hands-on, practical, practitioners-oriented certificate, where we draw on a number of case studies that we have all been involved over the last 10 years. And I just name a few. In China, we had a very big initiative with the Shanghai National Accounting Institute, which is also hosts the Asia Pacific Finance and Development Center. In Indonesia, we have been very active with the Disaster Risk Management Agency, as well as the National Audit Agency. In India, we had a big initiative in supporting the Swachh Bharat, which is the National Sanitation Program. In Colombia, the National Administrative Department of Statistics, DANE, and many others that I've not mentioned on that. But I just want you to understand that this is not, this is really practitioners oriented. This is based on the practice, and we are using those case studies in order to illustrate the various elements of the program. Also, I just wanted to mention very quickly that when you think about knowledge sharing in organization, usually you start from the bottom part of the pyramid, which is the internal dimension. Obviously, you want to strengthen an organization and within the departments and within the staff, so that the knowledge can flow. But very quickly, of course, for countries, the question is, how do you also share knowledge in a decentralized setting, from the national level to the regional and local level? Indonesia, for instance, as you can imagine, which is a very decentralized country, a lot of the programs we had was to involve the various regions, but also at the village program, and we draw some case studies from that as well. But also you can think about, for those of you, and I know some people that are joining today are coming from international organization. The question is, how do you connect organization or cities, as we will see in a moment, so that they can actually learn from each other and be able to influence what they are doing by capturing knowledge and sharing knowledge across countries. And what we have done over the last several years is rebuild a community of learners. In fact, many of the people that have been attending those programs are joining us today. And so this is just to give you the context of the organizational knowledge sharing program, and why we are here today as a community, in order to think through how those tools and techniques can really help navigate the situation of the global pandemic that we know today. So thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you, Bruno, for that overview. And indeed, I think as we'll hear from the speakers in a few minutes, if anything, the current situation has highlighted the importance of organizations being able to share experiences in real time, both in terms of addressing the needs of their organizations, but also sharing with others as the organizations are finding solutions or finding ways to better manage the various challenges arising from the pandemic. So without further ado, we'd like to move to our speakers and hear really about how cities are organizing to share knowledge and experience literally in real time about various challenges related to the pandemic. And we're very, very pleased to have with us the co-organizers of a very innovative program called Cities on the Front Line that's been organized by the World Bank and the Global Resilient Cities Network, as well as a representative of one of the cities involved, and I'll introduce them in turn. So our first speaker will be Francis Guesquier. Francis is the practice manager for World Bank East Asia and Pacific region, where he supervises a portfolio of projects for China, Mongolia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Francis has been working at the World Bank since the year 2000 and is known for his leadership on several flagship initiatives related to disaster resilience, including the establishment of the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, the Central American Probabilistic Risk Modeling Initiative, and the Understanding Risk Forum. He's also been key player in development of a number of innovative policy and financing instruments, including the CAT-DDO and contingent emergency response components. He was the head of the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Management, GFDRR, for a number of years. Francis holds a master's degree from Harvard School of Government and an engineering degree from the University of Louvain. Francis, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for this very generous introduction. And first, let me congratulate you for the launch of this initiative under the OKS. I think it's very timely. I think we're still struggling. We're all struggling with this new normal, and but at the same time learning. And I think it's opening so many new opportunities that the faster we can learn, the more everybody can benefit. And thank you for having us. It's quite an honor to be the first one to present in this series. I'm going to share my slides. If I can find the right one, I think this one is the right one. And maybe just let the audience know that, as you said, we have 3 speakers. My section is pretty descriptive. I'm going to go through what was the Cities on the Front Line, how did it came about, how did it unfold, and kind of our initial learning. And I want to preface this by saying that we're no way experts. I'm not sure we can really teach you anything, but we can give you a witness account or maybe a practitioner account on things we learned along the way and that we have found useful. This also doesn't mean that we've managed to apply it in every case, but I think there's some interesting lessons. Then Piero Pizarro will talk about his experience as a user, as a recipient, if you wish, of the information. He was one of our first speakers, because Milan clearly was one of the first cities affected in Europe, but then he attended quite a few of the session. And then Lauren will talk a little bit more about where this is going and how the City Resilience Network is using this to try to build leadership and support knowledge exchange in cities. So just just to set the stage, I think it's very important to realize that this was created almost on the get-go at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. I received an email from Lauren, actually not writing to me, but to my boss saying, well, you know, this is happening, it's important. I think in Asia, we knew it was going to be important earlier than in Europe and in the US. And so she had the insight of saying, well, maybe we should help cities learn from each other, particularly cities in Europe and the Americas and Africa learn from cities in Asia, which are a couple of weeks, maybe a month ahead in this curve and can probably share useful knowledge. And in fact, our first session was with speakers from China, including people from Wuhan, who could then share their direct experience with what was a lockdown and what happened in China. But from the get-go, we made it clear to explain to the audience, and we repeat this at every session, that the purpose of the series is to just share knowledge, right? This is not about, you know, debate or polemic or anything. This is about sharing knowledge. It's off the record. We want to have an honest and open conversation. If people want to quote what they hear, then they have to ask permission to do it. So a real learning conversation. And then we really tried to focus on bringing expert and practitioners, people who were experiencing what was happening, and then talking about how they've dealt with it. Over time, this has evolved, and I'll get to that in a minute. I'm gonna try to get to next slide. So we started on March 15, and at the beginning, as I said, we just started, we found a few speakers, we decided to do this. The first one was very good, so we decided to do the next one a week later, and then it was good as well. We did a week later, and lo and behold, we're now reaching the 30th session, which will be next week. It's been exhausting, so a couple of weeks ago, we decided to move from a weekly seminar to a bi-weekly webinar. This is not so much for the audience. I'm sure it's exhausting for the audience, but it was exhausting for Lauren and I. In the course of these 30 or 29 sessions so far, we had 80 speakers, about 50-50 men and women who've paid a lot of attention to try to bring voices from women, obviously, but also from all sorts of, all corners, from Africa, from NGOs, from disadvantaged group, as well as government, as well as city official and academics and others. We've had more than 3,000 single participants. So that's on average, I think we've averaged probably 200 to 300 participants per session. Now, I would argue that we have a semi-captive audience, not that this is compulsory, but it builds on Lauren's network under the city's resilience network, which has about 100 city resilience officers who are very keen to connect, very keen to share information, and then clients from the World Bank and other platforms. So a lot of repeat clients, but in total, 3,000 people individual have attended some of these sessions, which I think is which surprises me every time I see that number. And then, as I said, we've started from witness account, people who come and talk about their firsthand experience, to more structured presentation as we were going, and we had gone through 10, 15, 20 cities that were just presenting what was going on and how they were dealing. We started to focus the topic towards particular issues. How do you deal with migrating or groups of migrants? How do you deal with particular densities in the cities? How do you deal with a healthcare system that is overwhelmed? How do you deal with the financing of all this and the fact that cities find themselves absolutely, I mean, they're in the front line, their expenses increase, but their revenue have increased dramatically, including revenue coming from central government. So how do you deal with all these different dimensions of the problem. And then we've moved from kind of mostly presentation and a few questions to shorter and shorter presentation just to introduce a topic, and then a panel discussion where we have prepared questions, but we try to create a flow and a conversation through each of the session. Now, so these are some of the topics that were covered from metropolitan management, which is how larger cities coordinate with other metropolitan area around them, how you use technology, how do you deal with public transport, which is clearly an issue. Crisis communication is also extremely important, how cities have been communicating, etc., etc. As I said, far from us to pretend that we've got this to a perfect system and that each of these sessions is fascinating, engaging, and interesting, but we've learned a few tips that we try to apply. We're certainly not there yet, but we really tried to apply, and I've tried to summarize some of them here. The first one is it's extremely important to actually prepare the speakers, to have a conversation with them, to check that they know how to use the platform, to make sure they have the right image, right? So a lot of the speakers don't realize that they're the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen. One trick I learned only 2 weeks ago was that if you have like now a main image, you should have the mouth in the center, because that's why people look at when you're speaking. They're trying to read your lips. If you're speaking standing, then you should have the whole person and the belt in the middle of the image, etc. Another aspect that's proven extremely important, and I know everybody who deals with knowledge management and inviting speaker knows this, but it's even more important when you do it online, is to limit the time and the number of slides. You can repeat to people that they have 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes. They will always come with slides for about 3 times the time given to them. And that's because they always have more to say than the time imparted, but also because very often people are nervous and they want to make sure that they can fill the time with slides. And in fact, it's counterproductive. It's better to have few slides and have a speaker speak over the slide and have something to say, and they can read their script online, right? You can actually have if you project your slide, you can read and explain, but it's usually much more useful to have few slides, a few images, and longer time spent on each time, and take the time to really explain concept. And it's very important to, and that I find myself, is to really prepare the questions. From the beginning, we said, okay, we're going to take questions from the audience and then ask them. But I find that extremely difficult for 2 reasons. First, because as I'm trying to follow the presentation, it's very hard to go and select the right questions. I always try to do it, but even if I select a question, it is then very difficult to have a flow of question and to start to move from one subject to the other in a seamless way, and trying to build a story rather than, and unfortunately it happens that if I'm not paying attention, I end up jumping from one topic to the other, and it's not as interesting as it should be. And the same applies for the speaker. It's very difficult. People are nervous when they're online. They're not connecting with the audience, so they can't really read the body language, and certainly they get questions thrown at them. It's very difficult for them to really answer. So what I try to do is prepare core question and then see if question in the Q&A correspond to some of the prepared question. And then I will relate to the question and try to pick question in the flow that I had decided to build before. And then to keep the audience engaged, I think in-person event, we learned in recent years that it's good to have different type of activities, to have toys on the table so people have something to do when they're listening to the speaker, and they just don't go and take their phone to do emails, etc. So it's extremely important to first set the stage, tell people what's going to happen, what's expected, what they should expect from the presentation, what's expected from them, how long this will last, how they should ask questions, encourage them to use the chat box, etc. Choose a format that fits the topic. Is it an academic presentation? Is it a panel and a discussion among the speakers? Is it a debate? Are they going to contrast different positions? And then you need a moderator who's able to move from one to the other, etc. Also interesting to bring multiple voice, not having one person speaking for 15, 20 minutes, but have one person speaking, then another one, then a moderator coming back, and a third one. And that kind of keeps people engaged because it's different sound of voice, it's different way to engage. It shouldn't be too fast, but it's important to vary and move to through the 1 hour or 1.5 hours of a session by varying multiple voices. And then use of chat, use of pools and survey like you did at the beginning, Phil, Bruno, and Vincent. We've also tried to use cartoons. So at one point we had cartoonists attend the session, and as the session was going on, someone was drawing a cartoon, and then we would put it on the screen, and then people could react to this cartoon. There's a group in the US called the Cartoon Collectives who does that at the price. We didn't have a budget, so we abandoned fairly quickly, but they have a big library of cartoons. So now when we have to document and when we put each of the session online, we have a little cartoon that illustrates the topic, and that's actually a few dollars per cartoon, and it's pretty easy, and you can choose amongst thousands of cartoons, and then they'll brand it for you with your logo. One thing when asking question that I found very useful is naming the person who asked the question, so people feel involved into the conversation, right? And they feel that you're paying attention to what they're saying. If there are chats that are worth mentioning in the conversation, mention the person who talked about it and the chat, etc. And then again, as I said, try to create a conversation. When one of the speakers finish, have a few words to summarize what they said, repeat a few of the key points, and then make a link to the next speaker. When you get to the end of the session, do a little summary. I found that extremely difficult to do, I must say. I'm not very good at it, but Lauren is fantastic at it. So she usually closes the session. She always has something smart to say. I do the opening, which is much easier because I can prepare long in advance and then prepare the closing. Tell the speakers, look, at the end, I'll ask you the key points you want people to remember. Or I'll give you 2 minutes to close with a major point, and that then you get to a closure for the session, which is always interesting, and you leave people with something to remember. As I said, for each session, each session is recorded, the slides are made available, the video recording is made available. We also have 1 minute summary of what kind of introduction of each of the session. That's very easy to do because we just extract a few quotes from the session. It doesn't need to cost much, and then you can go online. This is, as I said, we don't want people to start quoting and using all the material too freely. They can do it, but we want them to ask authorization. So this is behind the password, but anybody can get the password. We just want to know who's participating and interested in what we do. So this is just a very broad overview. I'm now going to pass the word to Pietro, who was one of our first speaker and one of the part of the audience for many of these sessions. I guess I pass it back to you, Phil.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Francis, for that great overview. I think we've converted Francis from being an urban specialist already into a knowledge management specialist. Those tips and tricks are exactly, I think, the types of things that for this particular audience, we were hoping to be able to share. So thank you so much for that. Yes, I'd like to, it's a pleasure now to welcome Piero, who's joining us from Milan, where he's the city's chief resilience officer. He has more than 10 years of experience in climate change policies and urban resilience planning. And in addition to his role as the Chief Resilience Officer for the city, he's also an advisor to the Italian Ministry of Environment on policy related to urban adaptation to climate change. He's worked for a number of years as a consultant focused on urban and climate resilience, serving clients in Italy and elsewhere in Europe, and addressing issues such as environmental economic accounting, energy scenario, climate change impact modeling, and similar issues relating to city resilience. So Piero, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to hearing your perspective on the Cities on the Frontline program, and more broadly on how the Global Resilient Cities Network is taking advantage of your network to share with each other how cities are facing common challenges.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much, Francis, for the introduction, and thanks, Lauren. Good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depends where you stand. Let me first say that when it was March and the pandemic starts, we were after China. Milan was the first city that went in lockdown in Europe, and we were somehow at the front line of the emergency as well, with the need to understand what was the solution or the action that we should take it, because there was. I always said that, Lauren know that I always said that this situation was predictable but not thinkable, because if people say something unpredictable happened, no, there is always the worst case scenario. It also depends on us as a public servant or as a political institutional leadership to understand if we want to consider a worst case scenario in the view what we are doing. And so that at that time we were kind of disoriented, I'll be honest, because we have information only from China. We got a great support from Chinese government, Chinese cities were since the beginning being in contact with us and sharing information. But when Lauren and Lina Liaku, that is the European director, comes to us and say how we can support, and then we say, we have an option here. We can create synergies with the other cities, with the World Bank, to get the city's frontline. That becomes for us an important moment of the week, as we've done another parallel program, is named Resilient Shift Leadership Program. These two elements in my work become something essential, because weekly we had update on the different perspectives of the city and the different government when taking action around the globe, and was helping us given the different perspective, the different need, and also do an overview to how we should adapt the different solution for our context. That because there was not only public servant or CRO in the conversation, we got the academia, we have the private sector, we had a different kind of support that was really for us essential in moving forward, trying to make everything more supportive for the community. On the other hand, was also a learning process as an individual, as a professional from the others, because you get two different, we have split our work in two things in March. Now it's different. There was a bigger part of my colleagues that were looking on the emergency, and I was more in charge of looking after the recovery phase, so the phase 2. And then it was even more complicated, because you were working on a certainty perspective and in a certain vision what could be the world after the pandemic, because that was the frame, how we should look at the new normality. And then comes a learning process that we're doing, that the new normality is still not the time for a new normality, because we are back in several cities around Europe, maybe not in China, but in Europe, in the US, around the globe. We are back in the emergency, a similar one to the others. So the learning process, it's not something that has been finished. The learning process of the city on the front line and all this experience is something that we should keep going in the next few weeks. Just yesterday morning, for example, as a European CRO, we got a convening meeting among us to say, where we stand now. And there was colleagues from Paris, from Barcelona, they were given the new perspective, and we start again to reconnect after a short break over the summer, let's say, that we have focused more on the future of the city, on the future of the recovery funds and the next generation EU or different kind of funds that are going. We are back to an uncertain future, an uncertain week, because now we are speaking about day by day experience on this. And so, but the frame we have created with the city in frontline and with the resilience shift has been really useful over the last couple of weeks to myself as well, to start to recon what was the situation in March and April, to reconnect the frame of the analysis we have created through this experience, and then we start using again after 6 months for the new situation. That was something that has been really useful and has been created by the Resilient Cities Network together with the World Bank and with the other partners in the platform. And when there is something that is essential, in my opinion, what the network has done for us, the network was not to highlight how is important the network for itself. What was the role of the network is that how we can be supportive, you guys, to make your job more easier. And an essential element of the network perspective is say, we don't have all the capacity, but we have plenty of platform, partners, plenty of partners that can be helpful for you and for us to work together. And this kind of perspective has also been useful to create a momentum over the emergency, where the public and the private were working together to find a solution. That was not obvious because there is different interest when there is an emergency. And the after all is also helping us to create a need of public-private partnership for the recovery, because it's essential of the future of our cities. We cannot believe that the private can stand on their own or the public can stand on their own and then moving forward. We need to create this frame. So the network and the capacity of the network, there have been a lot of organization from our perspective, from my perspective, that we were more, let me say, they were more selfish than supportive. They were more looking how they could be attractive, could be done something for, was more self-references somehow. They were more looking at what they can do. Instead, the network and the World Bank and the City of Frontlines was really a way how we can convening all together, sharing experience, criticizing when it was needed, the wrong decision that someone had been taking. Was really a clear conversation. I still remember when it was in the call. I think the first meeting there was also some colleagues from. That would be great actually to come back to that conversation. It was a member of some consultant from the White House, if I'm not wrong, someone from the US government. And it was still the time when the president, Donald Trump, was still neglected the virus. And I would be happy to come back to that conversation with the guys, and because they were posing and questioning that Italians as Chinese were the people who were spreading the virus around. It was really diplomatic as was to be, but the concept was that one. So even this kind of perspective in the experience, it gave us how then the world is changing and how we should somehow reconnect and re-listening what we have done at that time and say what was wrong and what was good. So I think that one of the step forward in the sharing knowledge and the sharing experience is not only to keep sharing, is also to reconnect or recon what we have shared in the past, analyzing if it was good and wrong, and come out with an essential element to say, okay, that was correct, that was not. So we should also highlight what was wrong in the conversation, because there was then the reality was coming. So I think not as a critic, but as a suggestion or an envisioning. Let's go back to and analyzing what we have discussed over the last 6 months and keep out what was wrong. I think will help also now to communicate to our community what we have done properly and what we have made a mistake, because around Europe, at least, there is an increasing demand for justice, equity that is now on the street. That was in the US over the last few months. Now it is in Europe. We have a lot of strike with violence over the last few nights in Italy. And so, but it's the perception of what we have done and the perception of the future. And I think we have a role as a network and as a sharing knowledge experience among guys to clarify what was wrong, what was good. Because if we are capable to recognize that we have done some mistake, I think it's one of the most human communication steps that we should take to face this emergency, because the emergency is not finished. And I do believe we will have more other experience like this one, other pandemia. The pandemic is one of the risks that the WHO has got since 5 years as one of the main risks. So we should be prepared for this in a way how we can more create synergy. And then let me finish with a comment. We had this meeting of the European, let's say, board of the CRO a few weeks ago, and our colleague Lina was afraid that we were not too much close as a city. And I said, Lina, actually, we are more close than before, because maybe before we were close because we meet in a conference and we share. Now we are close in sharing experience of how to support our community, how to make the life of our people more safe and more helpful. So my opinion, even if we are from distance as a digital, the experience we have lived and the network capacity or linking the different CRO and the partners and so on has made a more stronger community, a more strong resilience community of CRO and institution and partners. So I think that this sharing experience was a real one, and not as, let me say, I'm sorry, I want to say, I don't want to say undiplomatic or polite, but too much we have sharing experience of best practice. That's it's more a brand. Now we had a sharing experience of how to survive from a pandemic. And I think this is sharing experience would be a new milestone for the future of the sharing learning platform experience around the globe. So that is my contribution. Hopefully it's supportive for all of you, and thanks to setting up this one. I'm just only to say, I'm sorry, I need to leave at 10 for the conference, because we have a city manager meeting that requires us to be part, as the numbers are increasing here in Milan. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Piero, for joining us. I know that as you've just indicated, Italy and other countries in Europe are facing a bit of a resurgence, and it's important to obviously focus on addressing that. Thank you also for reminding us in your last comments about how a crisis often can both promote innovation, but also the shared experience in addressing a crisis can really help to build social capital and community, and the importance of a community like the Global Resilient Cities Network, bringing together chief resilience officers to be able to really not only share for purpose of sharing, but to really face an ongoing common crisis. And that's a nice segue to introducing Lauren Sorkin, who's the executive director of the Global Resilient Cities Network, where she oversees global efforts to strengthen cities in the face of complex and interconnected challenges they face. And Lauren, together with a number of city resilience officers, was instrumental in establishing the Global Resilient Cities Network as a successor to the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities Network. Previously, she served as a resilience specialist in the Asian Development Bank and United States Agency for International Development to implement clean energy, climate change, and conservation projects in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from Tufts University and a Master of Science in Environment and Development from the London School of Economics. So it's a great pleasure to invite Lauren, who's also a good friend, to give us the perspective of the network on how sort of the group that had been together for sharing on various issues has now really been mobilized to address an urgent and common challenge. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Phil. It's really great to be here. And let me also congratulate you on this inaugural webinar and the launch of this initiative. I think Piero spoke so eloquently to this, but you know, speaking to this audience and in this context, you can really understand that knowledge sharing can really be a gesture that is more than, shall I say, it can actually save lives. And I think when we were starting this conversation, and Francis also spoke to this, we knew that cities in Asia were ahead of the curve, and that they had also learned from what they experienced during SARS. And so they were taking the pandemic very seriously. And at a time when certain governments, certain officials were not taking the pandemic seriously, you know, being able to share knowledge was, you know, nothing short of almost a political or a rebellious act. And as you can tell from my accent, you know, I originally hail from the States, and I couldn't, you know, sitting where I sit and working with cities around the globe, really stand by and watch without making a huge effort to make knowledge that could improve people's lives in cities available across our network. And, you know, doing that was not going to be enough, which is why I reached out to Samewaba, as Francis indicated at the time. And Francis was the one who answered that call and said, yes, we should do this. We should have this conversation and we should open it broadly. And we also had partners at the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR, who said, yes, we want to open this conversation even more, and send this invitation out to their 9,000 city members. And so, you know, we've been, I think, very grateful to have that kind of collaboration. But we were not going to stop short of getting the knowledge out to those who needed it and to practitioners specifically. And so I think it's just something I wanted to share with all of you, because the work that you do as knowledge managers, as practitioners, to facilitate these conversations is essential work. And it is frontline work in so many ways. So with that, I guess I'll jump into the way the network assessed what was happening and how we decided to share knowledge. So I'll complement what Francis said about cities on the front line, and then I'll share a little bit more about some of the other channels and tools we used to share knowledge in response to what member cities wanted to hear about. And I'll conclude with a little bit of information on a specific program that Piero actually took part in and mentioned, which is the Resilient Leadership in Crisis program, and how it worked and some of the knowledge management techniques that they used and what their findings were. So, you know, we started a community of practice. And for those of you who are part of this initiative or who have worked with the World Bank, Phil, with your team on communities of practice, will find, you know, the methodology similar. So we defined a community of practice basically as a group of people who wanted to come together and learn about a common theme, in this case, how to respond and recover in the face of COVID-19. And, you know, the reason we started it was obvious. But what we wanted to do was not just to think about the response, but this is something that, Piero, you said to me in one of our very first conversations about this work, which is we need to start to think about the day after today. Where are we going to be the day after? And even though we're still dealing with this pandemic, you know, 8-10 months later, and will be for some time, it's not a linear crisis. We started the journey with acknowledging that we were going to look at response, but also look at what we wanted out of recovery and building back better. And we heard this loud and clear from our cities across the network. So what we did was we started with a member survey to inform what our cities wanted to learn as part of this community. And we ran that survey fairly early in the conversation. So I think it was after we had run the series for about 4 weeks, we reached out to the network. And what we heard was that, you know, cities really wanted to use place-based, people-centered kinds of responses to these issues. So we use that kind of user-driven approach to source presentations and topics for this. We also heard from cities, and Piero, you mentioned this also in your comments, that cities wanted to hear not just from other cities, but also from partners, because it gave ideas of how they could bring solutions. So one of the other, I think, lessons that we learned early on in how we structured conversation was we need to bring in people who are working on similar issues with different perspectives. And I think that's been a recurring theme throughout. And I think the last thing I would mention, and Piero also spoke to this, is the importance of acknowledging similar roles that people are playing. And despite being in different places, being able to connect people that have a similar mandate where they are. And so we heard that more than 85% of our chief resilience officers were involved in either COVID response or recovery, and that many were in fact involved in recovery. So we knew we needed to create support systems to start having that conversation, even while others were still really dealing with response and day-to-day work. And I've said this many times in many webinars since we've started this conversation, but you know, in times of crisis, it's our networks that sustain us. It's being able to reach out to people with similar roles and lean on each other and ask questions. And I think that when we have the opportunity in knowledge management types of communities to open those conversations across, whether it's different national context or international context, to connect people in similar roles can be extremely powerful in these times of crisis, so that people can lean on each other. So in terms of what we heard from cities, as you can see, what we heard is that the platform for sharing ideas was the most important thing that our cities wanted in that moment. And so, you know, as Piero mentioned, what we didn't want to do as a network in that moment was to say, here's a bunch of solutions. Here you go. Instead, we said, how many different kinds of platforms can we create to make it possible for people to share ideas? How many different kinds of conversations can we facilitate? And so creating those different communities, whether it be through saying, okay, here's a community around tools, here's a community around specific themes. We tried to do that in as many ways as possible according to member needs. And then I think just one more thing I'd mention in this context before I go into the Resilient Leadership project was that in addition to the cities in the front line and the weekly webinars, we opened up regional conversations, and Piero talked a bit about the European. We had those running in each of our geographies. So the Asia Pacific cities had a recurring conversation. our Latin American, Caribbean, our African cities. So each of the regions had conversations that were facilitated by our team to share what they were going through. And then we also had pop-up communities of practice around how this was during the summer months in North America and Europe, how cities could safely protect populations from urban heat. And while we had one session for cities on the front line, we then also had a pop-up community that met several times and did some training specifically on how cities could manage urban heat with social distance. So we created additional forums for that. And then we also had, just very informally, we had global and regional WhatsApp groups for our cities so that they could be in touch in real time. And I have to say that there was an incredibly rich dialogue over those WhatsApp conversations. I mean, some mornings I would wake up and find that there were 10 different cities who had shared safe distancing policies for continuing municipal works and construction. Other days, people would be sharing uplifting videos and communications campaigns that their cities were doing. So I think the lesson there is sometimes it's just creating those channels, and they can be very simple, so long as the ground rules are clear and the intentions are set. And that as a facilitator, sometimes your role is just to start that out, create the expectations, and stand back. So finally, just to talk for a couple of minutes about the Resilient Leadership in Crisis. This project came together between ourselves and an organization called the Resilient Shift. And we had a shared belief that there was value in looking at resilience leadership as a skill. So in this case, we brought together folks around this particular theme, and that there was value in kind of breaking down barriers between the private sector and public sector. So there were 12 senior decision makers. They were all taken from a C-suite or very high management level, either within a public or private sector organization, and then 5 chief resilience officers, of which Piero was one. So one from each of our 5 regions around the globe. And there were weekly conversations that were not scripted, but that were asking the participants what they were learning week on week, what was challenging them. And then the group at the Resilience Shift and our team at Resilient Cities Network did the weekly digest to try to come up with common themes and then reflect those as learnings. And here are some of the themes that came up, just to show. Here was just that people were feeling down and needed more support, which I don't think would surprise anyone, but it was important to keep that in mind as leaders that were trying to motivate their teams. A lot of focus came out on cascading crises and the importance of continuing to acknowledge global challenges while addressing COVID. And you can see that in the bottom in terms of the climate and economic challenges that people were facing and trying to address in a more systemic way. And then a conversation that emerged around structural change and small business. And so finally, I think what I would add about that project is that it was very useful in identifying leadership behaviors because the group of leaders was very diverse. There were technical strategies that emerged. There were then strategies that were more behavioral and social. And I think one of the very high value adds that the participants saw from this process is that their own personal reflections week on week did add up to a body of knowledge. And so from a methodological perspective, having those regularly timed conversations, giving people that time to reflect, and then providing the service of consolidating that and looking across the different geographies and the different kinds of expertise provided a high value in terms of leadership guidance. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lauren. I love the approach of offering multiple platforms that then, empowered the cities to be able to share in various ways and in ways that made most sense to them in real time, rather than focusing on necessarily bringing solutions, particularly from the outside. I'm going to invite participants to pose questions either through the Q&A or chat window. But in the meantime, while we are waiting for questions, let me pose one or two to either Francis and or Lauren. Obviously both the World Bank through its various channels and the Global Resilient Cities Network, previously 100 Resilient Cities, had been engaged in knowledge sharing among cities in various ways. What do you find as different in the context both of addressing a global challenge in real time, but also the fact that the conditions in terms of requirement of using virtual mechanisms dictate that the sharing has to be done in ways differently than perhaps would have been the case in the past? Sort of, what is different about the current situation, and how have you addressed it in a way that perhaps is different than you would have a year and a half ago if there had been word about an upcoming pandemic?
Should I start, Lauren, or do you want to take it? And Lauren, maybe you can stop sharing your screen, although your lessons are pretty, I think, relevant here. But Phil, you've been at the World Bank probably longer than me. Same with Bruno. You know that the bank in and of itself is kind of it looks like a very centralized organization, but it's in fact a conglomerate of entrepreneur, right? And if as an entrepreneur you manage to move below certain radars, you can do almost whatever you want. And I think this is one of these initiatives where things have been going so fast that it's the best of both worlds. On one hand, we've been able to do a different session every week with absolutely no control. Not that there are always or often too many controls, but without any bureaucratic burdens, and at the same time tap into the vast number of experts and clients that are at the World Bank. So we were able to move quickly. I think that if this had been normal times, if we didn't have the crisis, I don't think we would have been able to maintain the same pace in having one of these sessions every week, because literally every week we had 2 or 3 topics we wanted to cover, and we had to limit ourselves to one topic. Now that we're entering a bit more into a new normal, and I must say that work is really picking up on the World Bank side, it's good that we've gone to once every 2 weeks, and we'll decide actually in the coming weeks where this is gonna go. I don't know, Lauren, what's your impression working with the bank? Has it been cumbersome and heavy? Has it, or has it been a good source of expertise? What do you think?
I mean, for us, it's been fantastic. I have a confession to make, which is, well, one of them is not a big confession because everyone knows that I used to work for Asian Development Bank, but I wrote to them at the same time that I wrote to the World Bank. And I said, we need to talk about this. We need to share expertise. And at that time, they were so overwhelmed with responding to the crisis, they couldn't find any space and time to create the series. So, I mean, I applaud the bank for being agile, Francis, especially you and your team, Barjor, and, Nelly, for being great partners. And we've been able to work very closely together and to do a very high volume, I think, of work. I think it's also been very helpful to source experts from within the bank ecosystem, as you mentioned. I hope it's been useful for the bank because, you know, in terms of featuring your own expertise internally, I know I was a part of a few conversations where someone would come on from a certain team and they'd say, oh, I've heard about you and I've wanted to work with your team, or I have worked with your team, but a long time ago. And so I think it renewed connections. And I think, you know, likewise, that's been something that has been very valuable over this time, is that because everyone's been focused on the same challenge, it's actually renewed a lot of network connections that may have existed in the past, but people get busy and they start to work on their own issues. But, you know, COVID-19 has been an incredible focusing mechanism. So I think that's something that, you know, we've had that moment, and it's enabled people to do the kinds of consolidation and networking that maybe weren't possible, as you said, Phil, like a year before. I think that is something that we found to be true. You know, I think the challenge is, and I see a number of questions in the chat about this, is maintaining that momentum and maintaining that feeling. And I think that's where there's a role here from working on, you know, actionable intelligence. And I think that in a lot of the work that, you know, the World Bank has done, and, you know, Phil, that we worked on with you as part of the TDD, the work in Tokyo, to take successful approaches and then move them into projects and hands-on work, is the kind of thing that, you know, we will be looking at in the coming months. How we do that in a virtual forum is something that I think a lot of people are starting to explore. And I think that this is where, you know, this network that you have can be really useful, because what is absolutely essential is being able to work through local partners. Travel, you know, the way we used to go here and there and work together is not possible. And it's not going to be possible for the next 6 to 12 months. So, you know, we've seen the second wave that, you know, Piero had to rush off to deal with in Europe, where borders are fairly more open. And so, you know, this is not something that we can expect. So how do we work through local partners? How do we strengthen them? And how do we keep people engaged? I think having things that we're actually starting to work on through these knowledge sharing initiatives is going to be, you know, a very real next step.
Great, thanks, Lauren. There's a couple of related questions here, or questions that sort of relate to each other, that maybe I can turn to now. There's a question from Ravi Ramakrishnan. Is how do you get government officers to accept evolved concepts like leadership strategies, since many believe they know and they don't like to share information hoarded, as they believe it gives them power? And a related question is, is it difficult to get participants to admit mistakes, even though it's a great opportunity to learn? Sometimes government officials are reluctant to admit that they don't know all the answers. Maybe hear from you, Lauren, on this one, and then Francis.
Sure. I mean, I think on the latter, you know, timing is everything. We have to sometimes let some time pass so that people can reflect. Sometimes when a mistake is too fresh, it's hard for people to talk about it. But I know even here in Singapore, while we were dealing with the repercussions of having COVID-19 spread very rapidly in the workers' housing here, that while the government was not in a position to talk about it directly, they were able to recommend experts who advised them, who could speak freely about it. And in fact, we hosted a webinar where one of those experts spoke to us. So I think it's the timing, and it's also the approach, right? It might not be that senior government official that needs to say that, but it can be someone else from that network. And often that's a way to facilitate the right kind of conversation and to document the learning earlier. And I think on the other question on like leadership behaviors, I think it is difficult when you are trying to get people to share information that they may see as their purview. And I think, again, it's really how you structure that conversation. Can you set up a partnership for that person to be able to share their knowledge in a way that builds towards common goals? And so I think, you know, that's where you may need to be creative, but I think without understanding the specifics, it's harder to speak to that. Certainly there are lots of situations where different departments have certain data sets that are more useful if they're viewed together. And so I appreciate that that is a real concern and can be a real hurdle.
Anything you want to add, Francis?
Yeah, well, I mean, it strikes me this question about government officials not wanting to share information or not wanting to change their mind. It strikes me that we're all a little bit like that. We shouldn't just accuse public officials who have responsibilities, who are may have particular reasons not to be able to either speak openly about topic, which usually I think is a mistake, but sometimes they're bound by some rules. But it strikes me that under the COVID-19, nobody had answers, right? And really everybody had to learn, and everybody has been humbled by this crisis. Everybody realized that we don't have it all under control. And as Pietro said, this was totally predictable, but certainly not foreseeable, or totally foreseeable, probably not predictable. And so, at least under our speaker series, I felt that people came with a lot of humility. I remember the session on Singapore specifically, where you had this explosion of cases in the dormitories right at that time, and they were very open about it and saying that really they had not foreseen this, and they were really dealing with a big crisis. Now they managed that crisis incredibly well. It moved from 20,000 cases, from 1,000 cases a day to virtually zero now, a couple of months later, and they had the resources to do it. Not everybody has the resources of Singapore, but they were very humble in their explanations. But in general, I mean, how do you get people to change their mind? I think it's more than the rational argument is very often about the experience. It's about the emotions that is associated with an idea. And that's what you do in a normal knowledge exchange program, where you bring people on the ground and you get them to exchange with people who have done it before, and you get them to see that it's possible to do things differently. Now, in the new world of the post-COVID world, is this still going to be possible? Or do we have to reinvent the way we communicate? Do we have to start, and we have started this reflection with Lauren. Can we continue to have these weekly or bi-weekly chat webinar, or is it going to end up being another Zoom call, if you wish? Do we need to start thinking about how do we curate content in a different way? We're preparing the Understanding Risk Forum, for example, which is always been a very innovative, very, very out there event with new ideas every single time. But we're really struggling to do this online, and we were going to test a few ideas, but it may be a complete flop. So again, I think your initiative in trying to learn about how to do this knowledge exchange online is certainly an excellent one, and one that is extremely timely. I'd be happy to stay connected and see if you guys come with some tricks that we can use in a couple of months.
Thanks, Francis. And that's a nice segue, in fact, to the next part of our last part of our session, where we want to actually begin to get a sense of the type of interest of the knowledge management or organizational knowledge sharing community around both topics and tools and modalities. Because I think Francis just hit the nail on the head in many ways, in that in the same way that cities have had to adapt in real time, and practitioners in other sectors within the knowledge management field We are adapting in real time as many organizations are looking at ways to continue everything from professional conferences to real-time knowledge sharing to even holding meetings within their organizations. On the one hand, I think we'll have a new normal in which the resistance or reluctance of people to use virtual tools will have been broken down to some degree. But on the other hand, there's going to be demand for a greater variety of tools to meet different types of situations. And I love the example that Lauren gave of, a small group, using a WhatsApp group as the most efficient way of essentially using an asynchronous tool, but with a small group and in a way that it essentially is captured and even can be archived. And I think the art, if you will be ways in which these different tools that have different functionalities can be blended together. So I want to really thank Francis and Lauren for joining us, and certainly feel free to stay connected if you'd like for this next part of the discussion. But I want to turn to Vincent, who, as we introduced at the beginning, is the one of the founders of the Bangkok University World Bank Organizational Knowledge Sharing Program, to lead us through a little bit of a discussion about where we go with this series, and more broadly on how the knowledge management community can best share experience and hopefully be better prepared to support organizations like the World Bank and Global Resilient Cities Network and other, let's say, sector professional-based organizations in utilizing knowledge sharing tools to support their operational activities. So over to you, Dr. Vincent.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Piero, for your presentation today. And so we have a few minutes left with the audience, so I just would like to engage all of you. So as Lauren, you shared, we're going to try also to develop a community of people, of KM practitioners, or people interested in capturing and sharing solutions to get together through this series of webinars that we launched today. So we would like to get a sense a little bit of what kind of topic will be of interest to you, so we can schedule in the upcoming session some speakers. We want to get some to bring also different perspective on how to share these solutions during the pandemic. So we will bring people from different sectors who have different challenge. So you can look at how different industries or different organizations have approached it. So I would like to, we have 5 or 6 minutes left to run quickly 3 different polls. So the first one, I just share the link, and I guess some of you already answer it, and I'm going to share my screen so we can see the answer. The first poll is, so as was introduced by Bruno early on, so we had built already a community of people who have attended our OKS certificate program here at Bangkok University with the World Bank. And we wanted to get a sense a little bit on how many of you in the audience today are part of this. So roughly one-fourth of you are part of this community, and we would like to expand this community to anyone interested in similar topics. So that's a good balance. Thank you. I'm gonna launch just a quick next poll. Okay, here we go. Let me activate it. Oh, it's activated. Okay. Now, what we will be really interested to learn about is in each of your organization, what describe your KM engagement since the beginning of the pandemic? So have you been slowed down in your efforts of capturing and sharing solution, or have you increased considerably these activities of capturing and sharing solutions? So we can see the poll is currently active. We'll wait a few more seconds. Okay, so we can see that almost 50% of you, well, let's say, yeah, 50%, the pandemic has accelerated our efforts to capture and share solutions. So maybe it will be interesting if some of you could share a little bit, I guess, maybe through the chat room. I don't know what you think, Phil, but maybe through the chat room to share a little bit what you guys have done differently since the beginning of the pandemic to boost these efforts of capturing and sharing knowledge. So if you can share just in a few words, what are some of these activities or practices that you have developed? So today we learn about, again, about this, creating this network of these communities of people with this similar interest and bringing different people from different perspectives together. Have you used a similar approach, or have you used a completely different approach? So it will be very interesting for us to, and for everyone who will share also all these results with all the people who attended today, to see a little bit the approach that you have taken. My last poll for today will be in the upcoming sessions. So what are, I mean, we can look at this capturing and sharing solution through different lenses. So will you be much more interested in looking at it from a strategic perspective, or much more from a practical perspective by looking at practical tools and techniques that could solve this challenge? Or will you be more interested to look just at the capture aspect? So today we learn about how this network helps for people to share and exchange their solution, but it's important also later on to capture them and to organize them so they can be reused. So what are, you can select more than one. What are some of the different topics that you will be very much interested to learn more about? So again, we will take this in consideration for the selection of our next speaker and of our next topics. The idea is probably to run this OKS dialogue series probably every 6 weeks with different topics. And for sure, we will keep you updated on our next event. So the polls, well, we can see they are still evolving, but it looks like all topics are some of interest to you. It looks like the knowledge capture got the most attention. And I think that's probably the most challenging one, and probably where there is a lot to be learned about on how to capture this knowledge and to format it in a way that will make it easy for others to reuse, or how to integrate this knowledge that was captured into new learning mechanism or training program and so on. Great, so that's wonderful. Thank you so much for contributing to these polls. We have 1 minute left. Maybe I will invite my colleagues, Phil and Bruno, to wrap it up or to say a few words to end this session. But I would like to thank, first of all of you. Today, we had around more than 40 attendees who joined today, some of them in and out, so maybe more than this. But thank you all we hope you enjoy this session. And again, we're going to work with the team to prepare some next and exciting topics and speakers for you in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you. Just very quickly before I hand over to Bruno, if any of you would be interested in working with us to organize a future webinar under this series, either highlighting what your own organization is doing, or helping us to invite speakers or panelists from other organizations that are doing work similar to yours. We'd certainly very much like to work with this community to organize sessions. We do have some possible cases or networks to highlight, but of course, hearing from you would be even more fruitful. So with that, let me hand over to Bruno for perhaps the last word before we close the session.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Phil. Very quickly. I want to thank all the participants as well. I mean, we have had a very a group of participants that have stayed all along, and we really appreciate that. And I think it shows to a great extent that there is really a need for this knowledge management, knowledge sharing, learning professionals to actually talk to each other and to share ways, techniques, approach, tips, strategies for sharing knowledge. To me, one of the most interesting comment was made by Lauren when she said that sharing knowledge is actually saving lives in the context of COVID or the pandemic. So I think we are onto something that is really important. I noticed that there are still some comments that have not been addressed, and we'll try to see how we can get back to you on that or address them in future sessions. But I think as a community, there is something very useful for us to do all together within the next few weeks and months. And we invite you to, as Phil said, we invite you to reach out to us to make some suggestions, including case studies if you want to present or bring some of your networks to show how you have been approaching some of the questions we have discussed today. But very simply, thank you to everybody. That was a very enriching session.
And if I can say the last word, I would really like to thank Phil and Bruno for all your efforts in putting this event together. And particularly, I mean, Phil and Bruno are based in DC. This is 3:30 in the morning for them. So thank you very much for all your efforts. And we are looking forward to have you at a better time of the day in our next series of workshops. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And please stay in touch. Feel free, we will leave the chat open for 10 or 15 more minutes. So feel free to share whatever you have, whatever you want to share, ideas, your contact information, what you have done to boost KM in your organization, anything. We will be happy to hear from you, and we will put it together and share it back with the community. Thank you all. Kapun Makrap, as we say in Bangkok. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Bruno. And thank you all. Bye-bye.